Today we are talking 80s guitar, so stick around. Hey everybody, it is Aaron from Warmoth, and today I am talking about guitar development in the 80s, the 1980s to be more specific. And to me, the 80s are like a second golden age of guitar development. Of course, you know, all the big stuff happened in the 50s with the advent of the Strat and the Tele and the Les Paul and all that stuff. And I think by, you know, the 60s and 70s, well, the 60s were magical, the 70s are notoriously spotty, and by the 80s, that stuff had kind of become mature tech, and people were looking for ways to improve on it, or they were creating gadgets and gizmos to supplement it or augment it. And so there were just a ton of people trying a ton of things, a lot of which were kind of snake oil. You know, I remember like gadgets like the guitar sock. I don't know if you remember this, but it was like a nylon sock that you like put around the body of your guitar. Or I remember there was the guitar glove, and you put on this guitar glove and it was supposed to just make playing effortless. Or I remember there was a couple of different devices that were made out of brass, and you clamped them onto your headstock, and it was supposed to give you endless sustain. And there were a lot of other snake oily things, but there were a few things that went on to become legendary, and they all seem to have a couple things in common. One was the player that popularized them, which maybe you can guess, but I'm saving it till later. And two, so many of these things had roots or originated in the Pacific Northwest, and specifically Seattle. It's crazy, like how much of the guitar development of the 80s that went on to become legendary happened in Seattle. So anyway, without further ado, number 5, the Stevens Extended Cutaway. And if you don't know what that is, it's like, I don't have an example to show you, but I'll find a picture. But it's basically an alternate neck joint. And instead of having the 4 bolts or a Gibson-style set neck, it was a bolt-on neck, but it didn't have a bolt-on pattern like this. It actually got rid of the heel entirely, and the neck had kind of a wing that came out like this, and then the bolts were a circular pattern all around the back of the guitar. So there was no heel. You could you could play all the way up to the 22nd, 24th fret, and it felt just like you were playing in the middle of the neck, because there was no heel. And Stevens stringed instruments, by the way, I grew up in Seattle. I grew up in Seattle in the 80s, and so a lot of this stuff was just around. At the time, I didn't realize that I was in the epicenter of guitar development in the 80s. It was just stuff I knew of that was around, and so maybe I heard about it earlier or heard about it more than people who lived in other parts of the world. But Stevens Extended Cutaway, or Stevens Stringed Instruments, was in Seattle. I think they still are in Seattle. And this was some guitar tech that never really caught on at large. But you can still see it most notably on Nuno Betancourt's signature model that Washburn makes, has the Stevens Extended Cutaway, and I think Stevens Stringed Instrument is still around, and I think they're still in Seattle. Number 4, the Compound Radius Fretboard, which was pioneered by Warmoth in Puyallup, Washington, which is just, I don't know, 15 or 20 miles south of Seattle. The compound radius fretboard, unlike a traditional fretboard has a single radius from beginning to end. Compound radius, if you don't know, it starts out with a small round radius down in the low frets, and it transitions gradually along the length of the fretboard to a large flat radius in the upper frets. So in the lower frets you have that nice round radius that makes playing chords comfortable, and as you get up here to the more lead guitar area, it's got a flatter radius so you can play cleaner leads and bends. And yeah, Warmoth pioneered that back in the 80s. Number 3 the Floyd Rose, the world's first locking tremolo system. And believe it or not, Floyd Rose, the man, was in Seattle in the 70s. I think he worked in the jewelry industry, which is interesting because before coming to work for Warmoth, I worked in the jewelry industry in Seattle for 25 years. And I must have come just a little later than Floyd Rose's time because I never met him or ran across him. But I certainly knew of him. He was active musically in the 70s and 80s. I know he was in a band called Q5 with Evan Sheely, who owned Bass Northwest. And I know that he was also in TKO, I think. So he was active musically in Seattle, and I think it was in the late 70s that he first started working on the Floyd Rose, but I think it was really like 79 or 80 when he actually got the patent and it became available to the public. And of course that made, like, you know, once you could use your tremolo bar without fear of going out of tune, it opened up all kinds of weird tremolo bar gymnastics that people could do, you know, dive bombs and squeals and all kinds of stuff. And I know that what really catapulted it to legendary status was he signed some kind of an exclusive deal with Kramer, and then of course Eddie Van Halen, that's the guy, popularized it. And before long, like, I don't know how long he actually had the exclusive deal with Kramer, but eventually that ended and it just became available on all kinds of guitars. But it was really, I mean, Kramer was huge in the 80s, so it was really the deal with Kramer, and then of course Eddie Van Halen just exploded the Floyd Rose tremolo system to legendary status. Number 2, the Superstrat, which is basically the idea of taking a traditional Strat and hot rodding it up with you know, a humbucking pickup in the bridge position and a locking tremolo system and 22 frets and a flatter fretboard radius. And all that stuff really is what led to the flashier playing and that distorted guitar tone that's so characteristic of 80s guitar. Man, I remember back in the 80s, everybody was cutting up their Strats and sticking Floyd Roses and humbuckers in them. And of course, all this was popularized by, you know who, Eddie Van Halen. And number 1, the Partscaster. The 80s was really the decade when the idea of building your own custom guitar from parts really took off. And of course, Warmoth was at the forefront of that. And Warmoth is in Puyallup, just, you know, 20 miles south of Seattle. Of course, right before Warmoth, there was Boogie Bodies, also in Seattle. After Warmoth, a lot of other companies came along that were all offshoots of Warmoth. So it was all going on in and around Seattle. But yeah, that was really the decade when people started thinking, hey, I can replace the neck on my guitar to get it exactly the way I want, or I can build my own guitar completely from parts to get everything exactly the way I want. And of course, the player that popularized that was, you guessed it, Eddie Van Halen. And a couple bonuses. I want to give honorable mention to a couple of things that I think you can't talk about 80s guitar tech without mentioning. The first one is the Steinberger guitar, the OG of headless guitars. And I think most people kind of put Steinberger, unfortunately, in that 80s box. But they're still around. But they were really right there at the forefront of the headless guitar. And the headless guitar movement has really gotten new legs in modern times. And there's all kinds of headless guitars now, but it really started back in the 80s. Another one that I think I should give a shout out to is the Sustainiac. And I don't know the whole history of the Sustainiac, but I know that it I know that it came out in the 80s and it's gone on to, I don't know if it became the Fernandez Sustainer. I don't know if they're related. But the first time I was, well, first of all, if you don't know what it is, the Sustainiac is a pickup-shaped device that you put in the neck pickup slot of a guitar, and it has a switch on it. When you turn it on, you can get endless sustain. I don't know how it works, but it's got some kind of a magnet that puts out a pulse and will keep your string vibrating as long as you want it to. And that never really caught on either. Kind of like the Stevens extended cutaway. It never really caught on en masse, but it's still around and people still use it. I think the person that comes to mind right off the top of my head is Neil Schoen, uses one. And that's it. Those are my top 5 guitar tech innovations from the 80s. Talking about 80s guitar is always a trip down memory lane for me. It's a very nostalgic trip. I imagine the same is true for many of you. And Warmoth was responsible for a lot of those innovations in the 80s, more than just the compound radius fretboard. In fact, this new shirt that we have, established in the 80s and still picking. And by the way, a lot of you guys have asked about this shirt. The plan, I think, is to have this available for sale on the website before too long, so keep your eyes open for that. In the meantime, if you want to know more about any of those guitar innovations that Warmoth is responsible for, check out our website. They're all talked about on there. If you have questions about any of our other products, give our customer service reps a call. They're the experts on all that stuff, and they're always happy to help. And until next time, keep on picking.